He divorced his loyal wife of 6 years, not for a stranger, not for someone she'd never met, but for her best friend. The woman who stood beside her at her own wedding. The woman Morgan trusted with every secret she ever had. And then, as if the betrayal wasn't enough, he invited Morgan to their lavish wedding. He thought she'd show up broken, grateful just to be included. A quiet reminder of what he'd upgraded from. But Derek Hayes made one catastrophic mistake. He had no idea that the woman he discarded, the woman he replaced with her own best friend, had just bought the $700 billion tech company he works for. Every badge he swipes, every paycheck he cashes, every title he brags about at dinner parties, hers. And when Morgan Carter walked through the doors of that wedding, his wedding in her building, what she did to him didn't just ruin the night. It dismantled his entire life in front of everyone he'd ever tried to impress. So here's what I need you to ask yourself before this story begins. What does a loyal woman do when she finally holds all the power? How long had she been planning this? And what exactly is inside the folder that will make Vanessa Cole, the best friend who stole her husband, wish she had never been born? Stay right there. Because this story starts now, and nothing about it ends the way anyone expected. Morgan Carter grew up in a 2-story house on Elmwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, where the radiator knocked every winter, and the kitchen table had one leg propped up with a folded piece of cardboard that nobody ever bothered to replace, because there was always something more urgent needing attention. Her mother, Sandra Carter, cleaned office buildings 3 nights a week, moving through empty glass corridors with a cart and quiet dignity, home before sunrise, asleep before Morgan left for school. Her father, Leonard, drove a regional delivery truck until 2 herniated discs in his lower back made every mile feel like punishment. He retired early in the way that working people retire, not with a party or a pension, but with a diagnosis and a prayer that the savings would stretch. There was love in that house. Real love, unpolished and abundant. But there was never extra, never cushion, never the luxury of assuming things would simply work out, so Morgan made them work out herself. She was the kind of child who solved her siblings' math homework for fun, then walked them through every step because she couldn't bear the idea of them being confused and pretending otherwise. She read the business section of the newspaper at 13, not because anyone instructed her to, but because the language of markets and systems spoke to something precise in her that nothing else fully reached. By 15, she had taught herself Python from physical library books, checked out on her mother's card, because her school didn't offer the course, and Morgan had decided very early that the gap between what was available to her and what she needed was simply a problem she would solve herself. She earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University. Double major, financial economics and computer systems. She graduated top of her class at 22, and before her commencement program had been folded and tucked into a drawer, 3 firms had already contacted her recruiter with offers. She chose the position that gave the most exposure rather than the highest immediate salary, because Morgan Carter had always been thinking 2 moves past the transaction directly in front of her. She was, by every standard that could be measured, and every standard that couldn't, exceptional. But she didn't wear it like a crown. She wore it like a secret pressed flat beneath her quiet voice, her careful attention, her disciplined habit of letting other people occupy the room while she sat still and memorized everything. She had learned early that people underestimate the one who listens. She had also learned, though she couldn't have named the lesson at the time, that being underestimated was the most useful position in any room. It would take her very far. It would also, for a long time, make her invisible to the people who stood closest. And invisibility, as Vanessa Cole had known from the very beginning of their friendship, was the easiest thing in the world to exploit. Derek Hayes had a gift for making every room feel like it was already a party and he was the reason. He walked into spaces like he'd been there before, shoulders relaxed, smile deployed at precisely the right wattage, handshake firm, and held just a half-second longer than necessary, which made people feel chosen. It wasn't manufactured exactly. It was practiced. Derek had spent the better part of his 20s learning which version of himself produced the best results in which room, and by 30 he had it down to an instinct. He worked at Apex Systems, Chicago's crown jewel of enterprise technology. Under its current CEO, Mitchell Grayson, Apex had grown into the dominant infrastructure software empire of North America, 42,000 employees, federal contracts spanning 17 government agencies, offices in 9 countries, and a market valuation that had crossed $700 billion the previous fiscal year. When Fortune ran their annual list, Apex was in the top 10. When other companies built their systems, they built them on Apex's architecture. It was the kind of company that didn't just exist in the economy, it was load-bearing. Derek had climbed to VP of Technology Partnerships at 33, and he wore that title the way some men wear expensive watches, not for the function but for the conversation it started. He talked about Apex the way people talk about places they belong. We're infrastructure. We run the systems that run everything else. He said it often enough that it had become a kind of personal philosophy, as though Apex's significance were his own. He met Morgan at a mutual friend's networking event in the Fulton Market District on a Thursday in October, 7 years before this story ends in ruins. The venue was the kind of place that looked more expensive than it was exposed brick, amber pendant lights, a bar running the full length of one wall. Morgan was standing in the corner near a tall window, holding sparkling water, watching people with the calm attention of someone who had no intention of pretending to enjoy small talk. Derek noticed her specifically because she was the only person in the room who wasn't working the room. He crossed to her. "You look like you're memorizing everyone." She looked at him with dark, level eyes. "I am." He laughed. She didn't. But something about the exact combination, his laugh, her stillness, the absence of performance between them knocked something loose in him that had never been particularly loose before. They dated for 2 years. He was louder than her in every sense. She balanced it without trying. He brought the momentum. She supplied the direction. Their friends said they complemented each other beautifully, and for a while, genuinely, they did. He proposed on a Saturday morning, not at a restaurant or a landmark, but in their apartment kitchen while she was reading the quarterly Apex report, not because she worked there, but because she read things like that the way other people read novels. She said yes before she put the report down. He always told that story as a joke. She always let him, because the part he left out, that she'd already analyzed Apex's 5-year growth trajectory, and quietly invested a portion of her savings into a position that would appreciate considerably, was the part that would have required too much explaining. She had always been more fluent in the language of Apex Systems than Derek ever fully realized. That fact would take on a significance neither of them could have predicted. Vanessa Cole was the kind of woman who arrived in rooms like a weather event, not violent, but total. She had grown up in Atlanta's Buckhead neighborhood, the daughter of a real estate broker father, and a woman who ran a successful event planning company, which meant Vanessa had been watching the architecture of appearances since she was old enough to understand that how a room was arranged determined what people believed about who you were. She was beautiful in a way that required maintenance, not because her features weren't genuine, but because she treated them like a professional obligation, which they were. She and Morgan had been assigned to the same floor of Elder Hall at Northwestern freshman year, room 214 and 216, and what began as proximity became, over 4 years, what both of them would have called their most important friendship. But the truth that Vanessa understood far better than Morgan ever did, was that their friendship had never been symmetrical. Vanessa was magnetic. She was funny. She read people with an accuracy that bordered on clinical. But Morgan was the one the professors called on twice in the same lecture. Morgan was the one the recruiters tracked down before graduation. Morgan was the one who could walk into a case study the night before a final and emerge the next morning with the cleanest solution in the room. Vanessa had built her entire Northwestern identity around being the most capable, most impressive, most sought-after woman in their social circle. And then Morgan had arrived, quiet and unassuming, and simply been all of those things without appearing to try. Vanessa smiled every time. She cheered, linked arms, said, "That's my best friend," at every achievement with a pride that looked, to every observer, completely genuine. But something beneath it had been curdling for years. It was not hatred. Hatred would have been easier to identify and therefore easier to defend against. It was something more dangerous, a deep, specific, patient form of envy that had slowly restructured itself into entitlement. The internal logic went like this: Morgan has always had what I deserved. Therefore, what Morgan has is rightfully mine. By the time Morgan introduced her to Derek Hayes at a dinner party in Lincoln Park, Vanessa had spent 11 years perfecting the performance of a best friend while quietly cataloging everything Morgan had that she intended to eventually own. Looking back, with the benefit of what this story reveals, there was a photograph taken at Morgan and Derek's wedding reception that nobody studied carefully enough at the time. It showed Vanessa dancing with Derek during a group number. His hand was on her waist. Her head was thrown back laughing. Morgan was 20 feet away, her back turned, engaged with Derek's elderly relatives. Derek's mother, Claire Hayes, was the only person who saw that photograph afterward and felt something she couldn't name, a faint, cold discomfort that she filed away without knowing what to do with it. She started watching Vanessa more carefully after that, but she said nothing to anyone. And in the silence of that decision, something was allowed to grow that should have been cut at the root. The apartment Morgan and Derek shared in Lincoln Park had 10-foot ceilings, original hardwood floors, and a kitchen that got excellent morning light. Morgan had filled it with books organized not alphabetically but by subject cluster: finance, systems theory, behavioral economics, a shelf of literary fiction she read slowly, one chapter before bed. Derek had added a bar cart in the corner of the living room, a massive television, and a framed Apex Systems company photo from the year he made VP, hung in the hallway where guests would see it immediately upon entering. These were small things. People in marriages have small things. They are not always symptoms. But over 6 years, the small things accumulated. Morgan worked as a senior analyst at Harrington Capital Partners, a respected mid-sized investment firm on Michigan Avenue. She was methodical, precise, valued by her colleagues, and quietly revered by the two partners who had been around long enough to recognize what exceptional looked like when it didn't announce itself. She also, in parallel, had been building a private investment portfolio, a layered, sophisticated arrangement of positions and holdings that she managed with the same quiet competence she applied to everything. She never discussed the scale of it with Derek. Not because she was hiding it, but because he had never genuinely asked about her work in a way that suggested he wanted the real answer. He asked the way people ask, "How are you?" As preamble, not inquiry. Derek, meanwhile, was ascending at apex with the trajectory of a man who knew exactly which relationships to cultivate and which rooms to be visible in. His actual technical competency was solid, not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was his ability to take credit for momentum that had been built by people around him and present it in language that made it sound specifically, attributably his. He had done this with Morgan's work on several occasions. There was a consulting arrangement, quietly informal, in which Morgan had provided investment analysis for a division of Apex that Derek oversaw. She had done it because he asked, and she loved him, and she was good at it. He had never formally acknowledged it to anyone at Apex. That fact lived in records that neither of them thought about for years. There were 3 moments when Morgan almost saw what was happening between Derek and Vanessa. The first came 18 months into the marriage. She returned early from a business trip to find Vanessa on their sofa, Derek's laptop open between them, wine open, both of them going quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when a room changes. Derek said Vanessa had stopped by to return a jacket she'd borrowed. Morgan found the jacket later. It had been in Vanessa's car the entire time. She filed it away without a name attached to it. The second came a year later. Derek had begun saying about opinions Morgan had never shared. "We think that restaurant is too loud. We prefer the earlier reservation time." She didn't think the restaurant was too loud. She had never said so. The we he was building had a different architecture than the one she thought she was living in. The third moment was the one that stayed sharpest. During an argument about Morgan's professional ambitions, Derek said, with a precision that could only have been sharpened elsewhere, "Everyone who works with you knows you're just coasting on your uncle's name." Room went perfectly still. Uncle Richard Carter was not a public figure. He was old money, deeply private, the kind of wealthy that didn't display itself. Morgan rarely spoke of him, not out of shame, but out of respect for his explicit request for privacy. She had confided the detail of his background exactly once, in a late-night conversation years ago, to Vanessa. Only Vanessa. She looked at Derek for a long moment. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen, put her glass in the sink, and stood at the window watching the street below for several minutes. Then she returned to the conversation and let it move past that moment as if she hadn't noticed, but she had noticed. She had noticed everything. She was Morgan Carter. She always noticed. She just hadn't yet decided what to do about it. The evening was unremarkable in every way that made it devastating. October. A Tuesday. The kind of Chicago night that hadn't fully committed to cold yet. The air sitting at that ambiguous temperature that makes you carry a jacket but not put it on. Morgan came through the front door of the apartment with takeout containers balanced on one arm and her laptop bag on the other, the way she had 100 times, managing two things at once because that was simply how she moved through the world. The apartment was too quiet. No television. No music. Derek was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded on the surface in front of him, which was not a thing Derek Hayes did. Derek Hayes didn't sit still and wait. He moved, he talked, he filled space. The stillness was its own announcement. Morgan set the takeout on the counter. She put down her bag. She sat across from him and she noticed before he had spoken a single word a manila envelope on the table that he'd been pressing one palm flat against, as though it might try to leave. "We need to talk," he said. She waited. He said it wasn't working. Said he hadn't been happy in years. Said they wanted fundamentally different things and he had tried, he'd really tried, but he couldn't keep living a life that didn't fit him. His voice had the cadence of something rehearsed, not cruelly, but carefully, the way someone delivers a speech they've written and revised until the words feel manageable. He did not look at her directly when he said most of it. "Is there someone else?" she asked. Her voice was completely level. He paused for under 2 seconds. It was enough. It was everything. "That's not what this is about," he said. He slid the envelope across the table. She opened it. She read every page with the focused, neutral attention she brought to every document she had ever been handed. When she finished, she set it down and realigned the papers inside the envelope. She picked up the takeout containers. She walked to the bedroom. She closed the door without slamming it. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for 45 minutes. The city made its usual sounds below. Somewhere on the street, a cab horn blew twice. The radiator, like the one from her childhood, knocked once and then went quiet. She had loved him genuinely. That was the part nobody would fully understand from the outside. She hadn't been naive. She hadn't been oblivious. She had simply chosen to love someone completely, the way she did everything. And that choice had been taken and used against her by two people who understood its value better than they deserved to. Then she picked up her phone. "Marcus," she said when he answered on the second ring. "I need you to look at something." She didn't cry until much later, and when she did it alone, once in the shower where the water covered the sound. Then she dried off, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at her desk until 3 in the morning reading documents. 3 weeks after Derek moved the last of his things into the Lincoln Park apartment he had apparently already leased before serving the papers, a detail Morgan discovered without trying, mentioned in passing by a mutual friend who didn't realize what they were confirming, Vanessa Cole called. Morgan was at her desk at Harrington Capital when the name lit up her phone screen. She looked at it for one full ring. Then she answered. Vanessa cried immediately. Not the careful, collected tears she deployed at social events, but something messier, or performed to sound messier. It was genuinely difficult to distinguish with Vanessa. She said she was so sorry. She said it had happened gradually, that she had fought it for so long, that the last thing she ever wanted was to hurt Morgan. She said the words, "You're my best friend," twice in the first 90 seconds. She said she hoped Morgan could eventually find peace with this, find her footing again, move forward. She said Derek made her feel like herself in a way she couldn't explain and that she knew that wasn't fair, but it was true. She talked for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Morgan listened to every word. She did not interrupt. When the silence indicated Vanessa was done, Morgan said, "Are you okay?" which was not the response Vanessa had prepared for, a beat of confused silence. "I what? You sound exhausted. You should drink some water." A pause. "Thank you for telling me." She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone face down on her desk. The office hummed around her, keyboards, a distant phone conversation, the soft percussion of a city building in the middle of its workday. She breathed in once, deliberately, and out again. Then she opened the spreadsheet she'd been working on before the call and continued exactly where she'd left off. She moved into a smaller apartment on the north side 2 weeks later. She took nothing she hadn't brought into the marriage: her books, her desk, her grandmother's quilt, her own money. She left the bar cart. She left the framed Apex photo in the hallway. She left everything that was his, which turned out to be most of the furniture and all of the noise. The apartment she moved into was quiet, small. It had one good window that faced northeast and caught the early light. She put her desk in front of it. She reorganized her books. She went to work every day. She exercised every morning in the particular way of someone not training for a race but running from something they refused to let catch them. She did not post about any of it. She didn't call mutual friends with updates. She didn't perform grief for an audience that would have been sympathetic. Derek's mother, Claire Hayes, called twice. She was crying both times, saying she was disgusted, saying Morgan would always be her daughter. Morgan thanked her warmly and meant it, and gently redirected both conversations away from what Derek had done, because she was already too far into her own calculations to need anyone else's outrage. She was quiet. She was still. She was processing. And in the silence, something that had been sleeping inside Morgan Carter was beginning to open its eyes. Richard Carter had lived his entire life in the deliberate manner of someone who had decided early that wealth without discretion was a liability. He was 79 years old, based in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a Spanish-style house behind a gate that wasn't particularly impressive looking from the road, which was exactly the point. He had no social media presence, no Wikipedia page worth reading, no charitable foundation with his name on the building. He had money the way some people have religion, privately, structurally, as the foundational fact around which everything else was organized. Morgan had visited him 3 times in his final year, each trip taken quietly without making it a discussion. Derek had called the visits inconvenient timing on 2 of the 3 occasions. She had gone anyway, sitting with Richard in the afternoons, watching old westerns he liked, organizing his medications without being asked, talking about markets and systems and the philosophical overlap between the two, which was Richard's favorite conversation with her. He had no children. He had one nephew on his ex-wife's side whom he neither trusted nor liked. He had Morgan. What Morgan didn't know, what Richard had deliberately kept from her because he knew Morgan well enough to know she would have argued, was that he had spent the previous 4 years restructuring his entire estate around her. Not as a gift, exactly. As a conclusion. As what made sense when you studied the evidence. Richard Carter was the majority shareholder of Apex Systems, not publicly known. Held through a constellation of shell companies and investment vehicles layered with the sophistication of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how wealth protects itself when it needs to be invisible. Apex's current CEO, Mitchell Grayson, managed the company with complete operational authority. He had never known the full picture of who ultimately held controlling interest. Almost no one did. Richard had never interfered. He had simply owned it, with the settled, patient authority of someone who doesn't need to announce what is already irrevocably his. 7 weeks after Morgan's divorce was finalized, Marcus Bell called and asked if she could come in. She sat across from him at the conference table in his Michigan Avenue office. He opened a sealed portfolio. He walked her through it with the unhurried gravity of someone delivering news that cannot be rushed into smaller pieces. She listened. She did not move. When Marcus finished, she sat with it for a long time, Through the floor-to-ceiling window behind his desk, Lake Michigan was gray-green and enormous, indifferent, going about its ancient business. "Long does the transfer process take?" she finally said. "We've already started. Richard began filing the transition paperwork 18 months ago. He planned this. He was waiting for the right time." "Didn't he tell me?" Marcus's expression was the careful one he used when a sentence needed to be delivered precisely. "He said you'd want to earn it before you owned it. He said you were already earning it, you just didn't know what you were earning it toward." Morgan looked at the surface of the conference table for a moment. She thought about Richard in his Scottsdale living room, watching westerns, saying almost nothing. She thought about his hands, steady and dry and certain. She thought about every visit Derek had called inconvenient. Then she turned back to the portfolio and said, "Show me everything." At the back of the portfolio, tucked between estate documents, was a sealed letter, not typed, handwritten in Richard's angular, uncompromising script. She read it alone after Marcus stepped out to take a call. At the bottom, beneath his signature, a postscript. "I had Mr. Domings look into the Cole girl after what you told me 2 Christmases ago. The file is in the blue folder. Read it when you're ready, not before." She found the blue folder. She opened it. She read it for 2 hours. When she finished, her hands were perfectly still and her face showed nothing at all. She picked up her phone and texted Marcus 3 words. "I'm ready now." The blue folder was not dramatically presented. It was a standard manila folder with a blue tab, the kind any office supply store carries. Nothing about its exterior suggesting the weight of what was inside. But what Richard Carter's private investigator, a former FBI analyst named Domings, had assembled across 43 pages was the complete and documented architecture of a betrayal so deliberate, so structurally built, that reading it felt like watching a building from the outside, finally understanding it had no foundation. Vanessa Cole had not simply fallen for Derek Hayes. She had identified him. The documents showed, through recovered communications, financial records, and the kind of detailed behavioral timeline that only a former federal investigator could construct, that Vanessa had begun her campaign 18 months into Morgan and Derek's marriage. Not impulsively, not emotionally, with the patience of someone who had been studying her target long enough to know exactly which doors were already slightly open and which ones just needed the right kind of pressure. She had identified Derek's insecurities with clinical accuracy. His fear of being outshone by Morgan's career, his need for an audience that reflected his self-image back to him without complication, his ambivalence about a marriage that consistently reminded him he was the less exceptional partner. She had begun, methodically, engineering situations that fed these insecurities with surgical care. The jacket incident had not been careless. It had been deliberate, a test of how close she could get before Morgan noticed. Morgan had noticed, and then been given an explanation she wanted to believe, and chosen to believe it, because Morgan's love was the kind that extended good faith long past the point where the evidence had stopped deserving it. The opinions Derek had started attributing to we think that restaurant is too loud. We prefer the earlier reservation. Those had come from Vanessa directly. She had been slowly replacing Morgan's presence in the texture of Derek's daily thoughts with her own. It was not accidental. It was deliberate overwriting. The comment Derek had made about Morgan coasting on her uncle's name, the one that had arrived with such precision it could only have been sharpened elsewhere, appeared in the blue folder in a different form. A recovered text message from Vanessa to Derek, sent 6 days before that argument, reading, "Has she ever told you why she actually got that job? Her uncle basically owns half of Chicago finance. Everything she has came from a name, not from her. Every lie, dated, documented." But the deepest revelation, the one that sat at the center of the folder like a stone thrown into still water, its rings expanding outward to touch everything else, was this. Vanessa had known about Richard Carter's wealth years before Morgan had confided anything. She had researched it herself. She had understood, with the cold intelligence she hid beneath warmth and beauty, that proximity to Morgan Carter was proximity to an inheritance that would one day be staggering. Her entire friendship from the very beginning had been an investment in eventual access. She hadn't wanted Derek. She had wanted what she believed would come with him, a legal connection to Morgan's world, Morgan's name, Morgan's uncle's assets, if she could position herself correctly when the time came. What Vanessa had not accounted for the gap in her otherwise meticulous blueprint was that Richard Carter was watching too, and that he had gotten there first. Morgan read the last page. She closed the folder. She set both hands flat on the table. She thought about the wedding, the bouquet, the fake tears. You deserve all of this, Morgan. Every single bit of it. She picked up the folder. She put it in her bag. She drove home in complete silence, the city moving around her in its indifferent, illuminated rush. She made tea. She sat at the desk by the northeast window. She opened her laptop. She started building. The 4 months that followed were the quietest and most consequential of Morgan Carter's life. She worked with Marcus and a specialized team of corporate attorneys to complete the legal transfer of Richard Carter's estate, including controlling majority interest in Apex Systems, into her name and a newly formed holding entity she called Cardex Group LLC. The name was deliberate, Carter, compressed and reordered, legible only to those who already knew where to look. The discretion surrounding the transfer cost considerable money specifically to maintain. No press releases, no filings that would surface in a cursory search, no LinkedIn announcement, no industry whispers, no social media ripple. Apex's CEO, Mitchell Grayson, was formally notified through the legal process required under the ownership transfer documents, a meeting that Morgan attended in person, in a conference room on the 44th floor of Apex's Michigan Avenue headquarters. Grayson was 61, competent, and had the experience to recognize within the first 10 minutes of that meeting that the woman across from him was not going to be a passive shareholder. He did not challenge her. He asked 3 precise questions, received 3 precise answers, and spent the remainder of the meeting listening. Morgan quietly resigned from Harrington Capital, citing personal matters, and accepted her own advisory role within the Cardex executive office structure. She moved into a penthouse in River North, not to display anything, but because she needed ceilings that didn't press down on her thinking, and from that height, she could see the entire city at night the way she'd always seen everything. As a system, lit up and legible, every moving part connected to every other moving part by logic that only required patience to trace, she commissioned an independent board audit of Apex's leadership structure. The audit team, brought in from a firm Marcus had used twice before, known for operating without creating noise, spent 6 weeks reviewing executive performance across every VP-level position and above. The report they delivered was thorough, professional, and in several places devastating. 3 executives were flagged as high performers. 7 were assessed as adequate. 2 were listed under a category the audit team labeled, in the language of corporate review, as structural liabilities with documented attribution irregularities. Derek Hayes's name was in that last category. His file had 3 annotations. The first noted a pattern of misattributed results across 4 fiscal quarters. The second referenced the informal consulting arrangement through which Morgan had provided investment analyses to his division, arrangement never disclosed to HR, credit for the results attributed internally and publicly to Derek's leadership. The third annotation was a recommendation, termination pending board review and confirmation from new ownership. Morgan read Derek's annotation with the same expression she brought to every document level, neutral, complete. She initialed the section. She moved to the next page. She also, during these 4 months, made one additional arrangement. She contacted a secure document distribution service. She assembled a package, carefully curated from the blue folder's contents, with all proprietary investigative elements removed, leaving only the facts, the dates, and the communications that spoke entirely for themselves. She did not send it yet. She held it in reserve the way you hold a final card, not because you're uncertain you'll play it, but because the timing of the final card is everything. She was not rushing. She had never been a person who rushed. She had always been a person who arrived exactly when the moment required, which is entirely different from being early and galaxies apart from being late. She was ready. She was simply waiting for the right invitation. She was on the penthouse balcony on a Thursday evening in February, the lake a dark weight at the edge of the city's light, reading the Apex Q3 financial report, which was, now, technically her own company's financial report, with a cup of coffee cooling in her right hand, when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She looked at it. A digital invitation, elegant, the design expensive even through a phone screen, the kind of presentation you hired someone for. The names at the top were Derek Hayes and Vanessa Cole. The venue was the Grand Whitmore Estate on Lakeshore Drive. Black tie, June 14th, 6 in the evening, and beneath the formal text, added in Vanessa's unmistakable choice of font, a personal note. I know this is a lot to ask, but I've always believed we could get through anything, you and me. I want you there, Morgan. V. Morgan read it once, then again, then she set her coffee down. Then she did something she hadn't done in months, since the October Tuesday when she'd sat in the dark on the edge of a bed that was no longer hers, holding herself together with nothing but the decision that this would not be the thing that broke her. She smiled. It was not a performance. There was no one watching. It was involuntary, the specific, involuntary smile of a chess player in the moment an opponent's confident move completes a trap that has been patient and invisible for 7 moves. The smile of someone who has been waiting for an event that just announced its own arrival. Vanessa had sent it because she wanted Morgan present at her triumph. She had always needed Morgan in the room to confirm the victory. She couldn't fully enjoy what she'd taken unless the person she'd taken it from could see exactly what she'd lost. That was Vanessa's deepest flaw, the one she had never examined, because people rarely examine the mechanics of what they need, only whether they're getting it. But she had made a critical error. She had sent the invitation to a woman she no longer knew. She had spent years studying the Morgan who loved and trusted and extended good faith beyond reason. She had not been paying attention to the Morgan who'd been building in the silence. Morgan picked up her phone. She dialed Marcus. Marcus, she said when he answered. You know that board meeting I've been postponing? Schedule it for the first week of June. A pause. Then block my calendar for the 14th. I have a wedding to attend. A beat of silence from his end. Then, Morgan, the Whitmore estate. You know that property is part of Apex's real estate holdings, she said. Yes, I know. Another pause. She could hear Marcus working through what she was telling him. So you technically own the building they're getting married in. Technically own the building they're getting married in. His voice, when it came back, was very quiet. What exactly are you going to do? She looked out at the city, every window a lit square, every lit square a life in progress, all of it arranged below her like the board of a game she had already quietly won. I'm going to go to a wedding, Marcus, she said. She hung up. She went back inside. She opened her laptop and drafted one email, 3 sentences, professional, addressed to Diana Reeves, Apex's newly installed chief legal officer. The subject line read, June 14, Whitmore Estate. Please prepare the portfolio. Then she closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and went to bed. She slept perfectly. The Grand Whitmore Estate had been built in 1923 by a railroad magnate who believed that architecture should make people feel the weight of their own insignificance. It had white stone columns that rose 40 feet, marble floors the color of winter cloud that caught and doubled the light from 3 separate chandelier systems. Grounds that sloped toward the lakefront in long manicured terraces, each one planted with the seasonal precision of a place that understood it was always being evaluated. It was the kind of venue that existed specifically to make people believe the best possible version of their own lives was happening to them right now, in this room, forever. Vanessa had spent $340,000 to hire a planner who had spent those months turning the estate into the physical expression of everything Vanessa had been imagining for years. Ivory flowers cascaded from every surface in arrangements that had required 3 specialist florists. String quartets played in 2 separate rooms so that no corridor of the estate would be without music. The guest list ran to 280, Derek's corporate colleagues from Apex, Vanessa's Atlanta family flown up business class, influencers who would post about it, executives whose presence would confirm that Derek Hayes had arrived somewhere worth arriving, Derek stood near the entrance of the main hall in a bespoke charcoal tuxedo, doing what he was built to do, making everyone feel that being here was a privilege and that he was the reason. He backslapped colleagues. He held handshakes. He told the same two stories about meeting Vanessa in different words depending on who was listening, and both versions ended with laughter that suggested destiny had been involved. He was, by his own measure, at the absolute peak of his life. Vanessa was upstairs in the bridal suite surrounded by 4 bridesmaids, receiving her 3rd makeup touch-up, telling the story of her and Derek the way she'd always told it. We tried so hard to fight it, but some things are just meant to be. And the bridesmaids cooed and no one asked inconvenient questions, because that was how Vanessa had always arranged the rooms around her. Pleasant, warm, and empty of anything that might complicate the narrative. At 6:42 in the evening, 12 minutes after guests were seated, and as the string quartet shifted into its ceremonial arrangement, a murmur started at the back of the hall and moved forward through the assembled 280 people like a current through still water. Heads turned. Morgan Carter walked through the doors of the Grand Whitmore estate in midnight blue. Not competing, she had never needed to compete. The dress was architectural in its simplicity, built by a designer whose waiting list Derek wouldn't have recognized but whose clients included heads of state. Her hair was pulled back with the exactness of someone who understands that less, executed perfectly, doesn't just match louder choices, it erases them. She wore no jewelry except a thin gold ring on her right hand that had belonged to Richard Carter. She had put it on that morning with the deliberateness of someone who understands that objects can be armor. She was not alone. Behind her, at a respectful distance that somehow made the full picture more deliberately ominous, were Marcus Bell in a flawless black suit and Diana Reeves, Apex's new chief legal officer, carrying a slim leather portfolio with the focused neutrality of a surgeon who has already reviewed the chart. Morgan walked to table 14. They had seated her near the back, predictably, and sat down. She picked up the printed program and read it from first line to last with the quiet attention she brought to every document she had ever been handed. Derek spotted her from across the room at 6:51. The blood moved through his face in a way he couldn't manage, guilt and arrogance colliding, producing a flushed, overcomposed expression that Claire Hayes, seated 4 rows ahead, recognized instantly and looked away from. He crossed to Morgan's table. He deployed the charming smile. "Morgan, you came. You look good." She looked up at him. "Derek, I'm glad you're here, really. It means a lot that you—" "I wouldn't have missed it," she said simply. Then she returned her eyes to the program. He stood there 1 beat too long. Then he straightened, returned to his groomsmen, and told himself she was being gracious, civilized. She'd always been too dignified for drama. He was right about the dignity. He had catastrophically misread everything else. The ceremony began at 7 o'clock. Vanessa descended the staircase in a custom gown that had been designed by someone whose fee alone would have covered 6 months of Sandra Carter's office cleaning shifts back on Elmwood Drive. The veil fell in a sweep that the photographer would later describe as cinematic. The moment was everything Vanessa had engineered it to be, and in a room of 280 people watching the most important performance of her life, she had never felt more powerful. She did not see Morgan until she reached the bottom of the staircase and began her walk toward the altar. And then she did. Their eyes met across the length of the hall. Vanessa's step did not falter. She was too controlled for that. But something rearranged itself in her face in a fraction of a second. Something private, gone before anyone near her could register it. She looked at Morgan in midnight blue at the back of the room, at the 2 suited figures flanking her like punctuation. And for the first time in 12 years of calculated confidence, Vanessa Cole felt the specific coldness of someone who has just realized the room they walked into was not the room they thought it was. She kept walking. She reached the altar. She took Derek's hands. The officiant opened his mouth. At 7:08, Morgan's phone buzzed once. She looked at the screen. She nodded once to no one in particular. She stood up. "Bell, stop right there before you find out what Morgan does next. Before you find out what's in that blue folder that Derek doesn't know about yet. before Vanessa's carefully built world gets handed back to her in pieces, before the most brutal and satisfying corporate takedown ever assembled in front of 280 witnesses goes into motion. You need to be subscribed to this channel right now because part 2 is coming. And if the algorithm doesn't know you're here, it will not bring it to you. You will miss the moment. You will be the person asking in the comments, where is part 2, and someone will have to explain to you that it was right there and you weren't subscribed. Hit subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Do it right now while the story is paused, and then drop a comment below and tell us exactly where in the world you are watching this from. Lagos, London, Houston, Toronto, Accra, Chicago, Dubai, Atlanta. Wherever you are, put your city in those comments right now. We want to see the whole world in that comment section. This story deserves a global audience, and we want to see yours. Now, back to the altar. Back to Morgan standing up. Diana Reeves opened the leather portfolio. She stood with the precise, unhurried composure of someone who has done difficult things in difficult rooms and understands that volume is the enemy of authority. In a voice that traveled exactly as far as it needed to and no further, she spoke. Mr. Hayes, and to the guests of Apex Systems present this evening, on behalf of Cardex Group LLC and the new controlling owner of Apex Systems, several matters of corporate governance require your attention. Effective 6 days ago, all executive contracts at the VP level and above have entered a mandatory review period. This is standard procedure following an ownership transfer of this magnitude. Room was completely silent. 280 people. Not one sound. Derek blinked. What ownership transfer? What are you? He looked at Morgan. She was looking back at him now. For the first time all evening, she was looking directly at him. Cardex Group, he said slowly. He'd seen the name. Somewhere. In the email he hadn't checked in 4 days because he was on pre-wedding leave. Diana continued. Cardex Group LLC, controlled entirely by Morgan Carter, completed its acquisition of Apex Systems 11 days ago. Ms. Carter is the new majority owner and holds board authority effective immediately. Letters were sent to all executive-level staff. If you did not receive yours, Mr. Hayes, our legal team will ensure you are briefed on what the performance review means for your current position. She closed the portfolio. Derek stood at the altar in his bespoke tuxedo in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress, and the blood left his face completely. The groomsman beside him put out a hand. His mother in the 4th row closed her eyes. Someone near the back of the room, one of the Apex executives, a woman who had worked under Derek for 3 years, took out her phone and stared at it with an expression that had nothing to do with the ceremony, because she had received her letter. She had opened hers 4 days ago. She knew exactly what was in Derek's. The performance review had flagged 3 years of misattributed results. The informal consulting arrangement, Morgan's investment analyses, delivered to his division, never disclosed, credit attributed entirely to Derek, appeared in the report with documentation so thorough could only have been assembled by someone who had been keeping records from the beginning. Morgan had not accelerated the board review for the wedding. She hadn't slowed it down either. She had simply let the process run at its natural pace and RSVP'd yes to the invitation. The timing was Derek's own doing. His worst professional day had found him at his most publicly exposed moment, not because Morgan had engineered the collision, but because she had simply refused to clear the road. Vanessa stood at the altar in her $18,000 gown with her flowers in her hands and looked across the room at Morgan Carter. And Morgan looked back at her, not with rage, not with satisfaction, not with the hot, obvious fury Vanessa had spent the car ride mentally rehearsing her response to, with patience. The specific, fully loaded patience of someone who knows exactly what is in a blue folder, who knows the calls and the texts and the 11 years of orchestrated sabotage laid out across 43 pages, who has had months to decide what to do with that knowledge and has chosen architecturally, deliberately, not to do it all at once. Morgan held that look for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her clutch, buttoned one button on her blazer with the unhurried composure of a woman who owns the building, and walked out of the Grand Whitmore estate without saying a single word. The doors closed behind her. Marcus fell into step beside her as they crossed the marble entrance hall toward the main exit, their footsteps the only sound in that corridor. "That's it?" he asked quietly. "That's part one," she said. "And part two?" She pushed through the outer doors into the February night. The lake was invisible but audible, the low, constant authority of something vast and patient. The city burned in front of her, every window a lit life in progress, every light a circuit in a system that was now largely hers. Part two begins when she reads what's in that folder, Morgan said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sent it." "I sent it to every person she has ever asked for a favor." He stopped walking. "She didn't. Morgan, that folder has everything. The texts. The plan. The fact that she targeted Derek specifically because of your uncle's holdings, that she was never after the marriage, she was after the inheritance. I know what's in the folder, Marcus." She got into the waiting car. The door closed. Through the tinted window she could see the lights of the Whitmore estate burning in the dark, her building, his ceremony, Vanessa's triumph that had just become something else entirely in the span of 90 seconds and 11 words from a woman with a leather portfolio. Morgan looked straight ahead as the car pulled away from the curb and moved into the city's current. She was not finished. She had barely started. What she had done tonight was not the revenge. It was the announcement that revenge was coming. The actual dismantling would be slower, quieter, more complete, and so perfectly legal that no attorney Vanessa could afford would find a single thread to pull. The car moved through the lit grid of Chicago. Morgan opened her laptop. She had a board meeting in 6 days. She had 42,000 employees who would soon know her name. She had a company to run, a career to rebuild in her own shape, and a woman who had spent 12 years treating Morgan Carter's life as a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be loved. Part two was already in motion. It had been in motion since the moment Morgan texted Marcus 3 words from Richard Carter's conference table. "I'm ready now." The end of part one. Part two drops soon, and it is darker, deeper, and more devastating than anything in part one. In part two, the full weight of the blue folder lands on Vanessa in the most public, irreversible way imaginable. Derek discovers that without his apex title and salary, the woman he chose has a contingency plan, and that plan involves someone even he never suspected. Morgan's moves inside Apex are methodical, surgical, and absolute. Claire Hayes reveals what she has been holding since a wedding reception photograph 6 years ago, and Vanessa makes one final, desperate play that ends with a call to a federal attorney. The revenge is not loud. It is not a scene. It is the slow, precise, beautiful demolition of everything two people built on a foundation of lies, executed by the woman they forgot was the architect of her own life. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, because part two is coming, and you will not forgive yourself for missing it.